Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to InspireOne's second webinar of 2017 series. I am Pooja and I will be your moderator for this webinar. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to a few things. In order to make this webinar a co-learning and sharing opportunity, we can use the text chat feature at all points during the webinar. For minimal disturbance during the course of webinar, we would request you to keep your lines on mute. And last and most important, there will be a dedicated Q&A session during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Hence, we encourage you to send us questions as you have them. We will take up those in our Q&A session. The webinar for today is being organized by InspireOne. InspireOne offers organization development solution to inspire business performance through transforming an organization's most valuable asset, their human capital. In past, InspireOne has successfully supported many businesses during business transformation through multiple solutions, and many of these have been in the leadership space. In today's diverse and hyper-connected work environment, there is an increasing demand on leaders to be able to optimize their team's performance by being agile and adaptive. A combined focus on emotional intelligence and competency development is quintessential for modern leaders to develop to their highest potentials. And this leads to the topic of today's webinar, which is emotionally intelligent leadership. Our main speaker for the webinar and subject authority is Neeta Mola, who heads the leadership practice at InspireOne. In about 3 decades of experience, she has majorly worked in the area of design, developing and delivering learning solutions for clients across industries. Neeta has successfully leveraged her broad expertise in emotional intelligence and its impact on unleashing leadership potential in her work with leaders across industries and levels. Today, we will also have 3 special guests for webinar, Sahil, Chaitanya and Nikhil, who will bring real situation to life during the webinar. Without any further delay, I would like to invite our main speaker for the webinar, Neeta Mola. Over to you, Neeta.
Thank you very much, Pooja, for this introduction, and thank you all very much for joining this webinar. It is actually my privilege to be able to interact with you, and I hope that by the end of this webinar, for both of us, there will be good takeaways. So I'll start the webinar by talking through the objectives. What is it that we would like to cover in today's hour or so? The first objective is really to understand the criticality of developing emotional intelligence for leadership roles. Now, obviously, this is not a new thing, but what we are finding more and more is that there is a great refocus on this area, and we want to understand that. The second objective is to be able to take real case examples. So as Pooja said, we have 3 guests who will talk about their real situations, and we will see how this is linked to emotional intelligence and also to leadership. The third objective is then to understand how emotional intelligence can be developed and was developed in these 3 situations. Of course, we will leave the last 10 minutes or so for question and answers, and we hope that we will be able to interact a lot with you during that process. Let's start with the first objective. Why is it that today emotional intelligence is becoming even more critical in leadership roles? And let's start by looking at the environment. Not talking about the VUCA world is probably not new. Everyone is familiar with that. Everybody knows about it. But I just thought that it would be useful to quickly review some of the things that have happened in the recent past, because sometimes even we don't realize how chaotic and uncertain times we have been through. So starting from June 2016, the first event that sort of shook the world was when Britain decided to vote out of the European Union, the Brexit. 5th September 2016, Reliance launched GI services in India, and this sort of changed the game for all telecom providers. 8th November, India demonetized its currency, and I think it's still in our recent memory to remember how it created chaos for all of us individually and in organizations. 8th November 2016, nobody expected, the most unexpected event happened. Donald Trump won the elections. And even to this day, that uncertainty still plays. Now, while these are the uncertainties that we see in the external world, what is also important to remember and to know is that these uncertainties similarly cause a lot of uncertainties within us. So we experience chaos, uncertainty, turmoil more than ever before within us. And unless we know about this and we can handle this, handling the volatility and the uncertainty in the external world becomes very, very difficult. The good news is this, that while we're looking at the events in the past, there is one leader, and we're taking the example of Nelson Mandela here, who has demonstrated what leadership in this VUCA environment should look like, what does good look like. Now, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison to take over the reins of presidentship for South Africa, it was widely expected that there would be chaos. The expectation was that there could be a civil war. The expectation was that because of polarization between the blacks and whites, there would be a lot of conflict, and this to resolve would be quite impossible. In fact, a lot of pundits foresaw that this is the opportunity probably that will come about where people could even take revenge. But it is to the credit of Nelson Mandela that in his leadership, what he did was he looked at this as an opportunity, and he went about to transcend these differences and give and create a big vision to all of South Africa, whether it was the blacks or it was the whites. And instead of creating polarization, he looked at diverse views which could coexist and flourish together. And this is what is the hallmark of a great leader. In fact, what we say is that a leader who's able to solve issues at higher levels of consciousness than the level at which these issues occur is really what we are looking for, and is really the leader of this century. Moving on, so what we are saying is that the traditional way of leading will no longer hold good. We have to look at more advanced, more mature, more evolved ways of leadership. But let's look at the traditional model of leadership so far. Of course, this is based on competencies, and competencies in the last decade have played a huge positive role in being able to define leadership behaviors and leadership behaviors at different levels, which is the proficiency levels. And this has made it possible for people, for HR, to really integrate all the processes that HR looks at, right from talent acquisition to talent management to talent development to performance management, in a very synchronized way, keeping competencies at the center of all the processes. And this has been really great. And we've also seen how leadership competencies have been the center of focus in leadership development. So leaders are assessed on these competencies, their gaps are identified, they are then developed through training, coaching, and mentoring. And finally, we also look at the change. So we look at the observable change in behaviors through the competency movement. And this is really great, and this has really been very helpful. However, in today's context, what we strongly believe and what research also says is that this is not going to be enough. So while we still need to concentrate on competencies, we also need to look at those less tangible factors, for example, the emotions, for example, the paradigms, for example, the mental models, because behaviors are more fluid, and it is all this less tangible aspect of a person's mental makeup that ultimately causes a behavior and causes the effectiveness of the behavior. So keeping that in mind, what is coming about is that there needs to be a renewed focus or an increased focus on the less tangible internal processes that cause the behavior, and that is really what we need to also look at in terms of development. So if this is what is required, let's look at how the research is coming about in terms of new trends around leadership development. Of course, all of you would be familiar with the neuroscience. Neurosciences is really what is bringing hard science into tangible ways of measuring human behavior and linking this to leadership and social sciences. Finally, we don't talk about behaviors just in a very fuzzy way. We have concrete data coming from the way our brains work and the images of that to substantiate development of human behavior and also understand why a particular behavior exists. Positive psychology in the last decade or so has become very important because this starts from a belief that people want to live meaningful lives. They want to be in a positive frame of mind, and hence working on positivity, whether it is through optimism or through being able to have a positive mindset, has really helped people to transcend some of the difficulties that they have increasingly gone through and are able to therefore look at a world and be able to transmit more positive emotions. However, another new science that is coming up is emodiversity, which says that while positive emotions are very critical and these help people to motivate themselves more and motivate others more, what is also very important for leadership today is something called emodiversity, emotional diversity. So just as we value diversity in thoughts and in thinking and in ethnicity and so many other factors, what is now being propagated is that a leader must be able to access and be able to manage multiple emotions, and these emotions may not be only positive ones, because it is through these emotional diversities that we are able to access more important parts of our brain and more deeper parts of our brain and solve problems which are more deeper and more complex. Building on that is a trend which is talking about vertical development. And this simply means, and maybe I can take the analogy of a cup. So it's like, when we talk about leadership development, there is a cup, and then we are going on pouring more and more water into that cup and take the water as competencies. So we are constantly developing leaders by giving them or developing them on more and more competencies, which is great. But what vertical development talks about is that after a certain point, this is not going to work on its own. And we have to work on the shape of the cup, the size of the cup, and how the cup itself can transform. This is extremely transformational development, which really links to the fact, how do leaders perceive data? How do they think about things? And how can we make their thinking more complex, more deep, more evolved, so that they are better prepared to handle leadership complexities that they face. The good news, of course, here is that what is also being researched is that human development takes place throughout life. So it's not as if human development can only take place up to a certain age or to a certain level. In fact, neuroscience has brought about the fact that brains can be changed. It's the aspect of neuroplasticity. And vertical development is based on the research which says that there are phases of human development, and the higher phases look at more complexities, which means that we really look at how the internal processes of leaders really work. In terms of the way we have looked at things at IBM has always worked on this model of nature and nurture. So whenever we talk about development, we don't look at only the nurture, which is the competency part of development. We also look at the nature, which is the inherent part of a person's mindset, which really creates change. And we look at a combination of this to be able to create leadership development processes in our work. In fact, I would also like to share with you that there have been organizations which are looking at new ways of leadership development. So rather than going through the old ways of saying that, okay, these are our leaders, we've identified them, now let's measure where do they fare on these leadership competencies. Let's look at a 70-20-10 principle of developing them. What these companies are doing, and I'll take the examples of 3 companies here, Barclays, Walt Disney, and Unilever. What they are doing is introducing the concept of what is called social intrapreneurship in their organizations, which pretty much helps them to deal with what we call the VUCA environment. So, for example, they are expected to come up with social projects, and these projects are to do with social well-being, and that is especially so because you're taking them away from a very organizational way of thinking into a broader, larger plane. Looking at how they would innovate, what are their ideas of creating innovation, for these social projects. They're also encouraging people to look at projects which go against the normal grain of the way things are done in the organization, so that leaders are better prepared to look at things which don't exist, but things which need to possibly exist in different environments. And through these processes of coming up with innovative projects, what then happens is development happens in this situation. So development is not happening outside of this, it's not happening in a classroom, it is happening through pursuing some of these intrapreneurship projects which have a far greater meaning and which are different from the way processes run in their organization. So very much helping them to look at how they would look at change, how they would look at things which are different, how they would look at influencing internal stakeholders, because the idea is to do things which are very, very different. And also engaging, and that's the most important part. The starting point is engaging them emotionally in things which are extremely meaningful. And that is the crux of development. So when leaders are highly engaged, they will also stretch, they will also learn. That's the principle and that's the belief. So this is the good news. These are some good examples that we've talked about when we are looking at what is it that's happening now and why is it that emotional intelligence is going to become more and more critical as we go along. I would just like to summarize this very quickly to talk about what does refocusing really mean. So the first point is, yes, the turbulence outside necessarily means that we will go through more turbulence within. And in the leadership world, we have to learn how to really manage this better and better as we go along. What we're also talking about is there is a need for leaders to believe and to build themselves consciously right through their lifetime now. And this is also something which is extremely positive and can be done. And that is to look at the fact of not just learning more skills, but learning and understanding how they operate within and seeing what they can do to develop from that frame as well. Learning to regulate and manage their emotions and master them so that they can leverage these emotions in the right way as the context demands. And finally, what we're talking about is that the key to leadership development really is emotional intelligence. So whether it is about engaging, whether it is about using positive emotions, without emotional intelligence and a focus on this in a concerted way, leaders are going to find it more and more difficult to handle the complex problems that will come their way in the course of their careers. So that's really about the first objective, which is to understand why this is critical. I'm sure and I hope that we've got some understanding of this, but we will continue to build on this through our second objective, which is now what we're going to do is take up real case examples, and we will, through these examples, understand how these case examples link to emotional intelligence, also linked to leadership situations that we face in our day-to-day lives. And what we are going to look at are three situations. The first one is decision making and problem solving. The second one is collaborating through differences, because this is something which is coming up more and more. And the third is really talking about engagement and leading change. But before we get into this, I would just like to give a quick overview on how we really process information in our brains. And this is, of course, new research that is coming up all the time, so it is quite interesting. But let me just take you through this frame so that when we get into the situations, we can keep this in mind. Now, what neuroscience has brought about is that there is this dual processing theory, which means that at all points of time, we are processing information through two main circuitries in our brain. Now, earlier it was believed that there was just one system, so say system 1, which was more automatic, unconscious, fast, and this was really the default way in which we processed information. This is the evolutionary or old system or the old school of thought. But now what is believed is that this is not the only system. There is a system 2, which is more slower, more controlled, more conscious. And when this comes into play, what the brain does is that it focuses more attention on the task at hand. And that is really important and that is really critical, because when we are looking at complex situations, we need the brain to think and focus in a more concerted way. Now, let's take an example. So let's take an example of the need for leaders to look at unstated needs of customers. So these are not stated needs, these are complex unstated needs. Now, things that sometimes even the customers may not know of themselves. Now that's a complex situation which needs to be dealt with or looked at through system 2, which means that a leader needs to be more observant, more slow, needs to look at intuitive processes of the information gathering, but also look at factual, more analytical processes together to try and figure out what could these needs of the customer which are unstated be. So when we look at this system 2 way of thinking, it has a direct relationship on the way we are able to regulate our emotions, the way we are able to manage our impulses. So hold on to our horses and think more deeply. The more we are able to manage our biases and objectivity, and the deeper we are able to go into problem solving processes. And really why this is so important in understanding is because for the first time, when we look at behaviors and we understand where do they emanate from, where do they come from, this gives us a process and this gives us a very scientific way of understanding behaviors, which is something that we will now apply when we go into the next situations. So let's start with looking at, so we've already said we're going to look at these 3 important areas: problem solving and decision making, collaboration and facilitating change. And we'll start with looking at the first situation, which is decision making and problem solving. And the way we will look at the situation is we'll invite the first guest that we have over here, Sahil, to give his story. And this is his real life story. And once we get his story, we will look at what is the learning that we can get from this situation and understanding what really happened in the situation as well. So over to you, Sahil. Sahil, can you help us with giving us your story with respect to this situation?
Sure. Thank you, Neeta. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sahil, and I work as a project manager for Quattro Foods. Over the last few months, I've been coaching and training Mohit, who's my team member. Now, Mohit received an average rating in his last performance review. He reminds me of myself as I and he have worked together, and he's demonstrated a strong desire to improve. Unfortunately, due to the recession, our company started facing major losses. To manage this situation at the year end, the company decided to let go of low performers and raise the performance standard, effectively putting a check to promotions and higher salaries. Now, while I understand that it is the need of the hour, it's people like Mohit who are hit the hardest. In the new performance standard, his performance will be rated as medium, even though he deserves more. I can't help but feel responsible as he is one of the most hardworking employees that we have. He's worked really hard in the last year. It's simply unfair that he has to pay for the company's overall losses. All along this year, I've been telling him that if he works hard, he will get a promotion. How can I face him now? In fact, he will never trust me or the company. I've tried talking to my bosses and the HR, but they can't help. They tell me how to communicate this to him, not how to help him. Our company is just being ruthless and self-serving in this case. Now, Mohit has worked really hard and I don't know how I can face him. I couldn't work in this environment and hence I resigned. This is something that is a personal decision, but I think this is something that's the best that I could do.
So here is Sahil's resignation story. What could make him react in such an emotional way? Well, was there another way, Neeta, to address this?
So absolutely. If we look at Sahil's story and the question that you asked, did he take the optimum decision? The answer clearly is no. But then why did he do that? So he clearly used system 1 thinking, where the need really was for him to use a system 2 thinking, because there were many complexities involved. But what made him, what was it that made him unable to use really the system 2 thinking? One, of course, is obvious. He could not manage his emotions. He was frustrated. He was angry. He felt betrayed by the company, and he felt he's going to betray Mohit as well. And that was something that he could not stomach. It was very difficult for him. Perhaps that clashed with his value system. There were unconscious biases, and I want to just bring this point here, that research today has shown that there are as many as 150 biases which we operate from, and all of them, most of them in fact, are at an unconscious level. So while he didn't know it, but clearly there were multiple biases. For example, he felt, Mohit reminds me of me, and that is a high level of personalization. So he felt very strongly attached to Mohit, and therefore his emotional attachment also did not allow him to see things in a very objective way. Also, for example, in this case, he felt, oh my God, the worst is going to happen. Mohit is never ever going to trust anyone in his life again. It's like catastrophizing. It's believing that the worst is going to happen, and it's, his entire character is going to get impacted, and I'm going to be responsible for it. So very high level of emotions and a very high level of biases really playing, which he may not be fully aware of. Of course, it is low impulse control, because he says, I'm going to resign. And that resignation is not going to help anyone. Not him, not Mohit, not the organization. In fact, if you really look at it in a situation where there is recession, possibly Mohit also may be feeling, thank God, at least I have a job. But that's not what is happening here. His decision is obviously coming from a perspective that he cannot really bear this anymore, and he's taking a decision based on that. So let's see that if he was able to use system 2, how could he have looked at the situation differently? Perhaps he would have looked at all these three perspectives, the perspective of the organization, the perspective of Mohit, and his own perspective simultaneously, in parallel, and seen what is it that he can do which can be in the benefit or can benefit all the three different stakeholders, so to say, in this situation. And maybe he would have taken a decision, or he could have taken a decision to say that my going away is not going to help. I have to help the organization. That's my leadership role as well. And you cannot get away from that. I mean, leaders are not only about doing positive things. Sometimes they have to take these tough calls. But how can I still help Mohit within the organization, maybe to find more meaningful work, maybe give him more independent work, maybe give him some more status-related opportunities so that he doesn't feel, let down, and also manage his own self well, and understand why does he react like this in situations, and build on his own emotional intelligence as well. And that could have been a good way of looking at system 2. However, what I really want to bring out over here, that this is not just Sahil's story. And perhaps one of the events that we can look at is the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. And we all know that this crisis was brewing from 2002-2003, and yet the best leaders couldn't prevent this from happening. And really what happened in that situation, and I'll just quote one of the important leaders here, which is Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of US Federal Reserve. And what he said was, I made a mistake in presuming that the financial firms could regulate themselves. Now that's a presumption he made, that's an assumption, that's a bias he made, and things really toppled because of that. So even the best thinkers, the most strategic leaders can fall prey to this. And hence it is really important to understand, for leaders, what is my trigger? What can cause me to get derailed? So I hope that helps Pooja in understanding what is it that happened, why did he react, and
Right.
how we all react,
Right.
and why it is important to build on our emotional intelligence.
Thank you so much, Neeta. So this was a decision-making and problem-solving situation. Now let's look at Chaitanya's story for collaboration. Over to you, Chaitanya.
Yeah, thank you, Pooja, and thank you, Neeta. Hello, everyone. This is Chaitanya. I, along with my friends, we had started a technology company back in 2000. I worked especially hard to make the company and reach a level where we could partner with the best people from all over the world. Sure enough, we got an offer from Tekram. It was the opportunity that I had been waiting for. As you can imagine, the negotiations, they were as heated as you could expect. We wanted to show our expertise and to have the upper hand, and we eventually did. I was actually the first person who noticed that their representative, he had made a mistake, a slight calculation error. but I was very quick to jump on that. I questioned their expertise and their superiority in the field. For a moment, we did get our way. The deal was finalized based on our requirements. I felt victorious. 11 years of hard work was finally paying off for me. But what I did not realize was that this victory was coming at Techrum's expense. As the deal it progressed, our problems they just kept piling on. It took me a while to realize that our point of contact at Techrum was actually the same person who made the mistake during the negotiation. The exact same person whom I had humiliated to get my way. As you can imagine, the deal, it turned sour. No actions were taken because Techrum kept finding operational flaws in our company rather than focusing on strategic issues. After a whole year of back and forth, the deal was finally called off. All because I am more competitive than cooperative. Had I thought of creating a win-win situation, maybe I could have achieved something far, far greater.
So organizations have become more and more competitive. In this VUCA world, in a past research, 65% felt that in order to succeed, there is a need to be very competitive. However, Neeta, we can see that being competitive can have adverse consequences too. So what is your perspective?
So absolutely. So like what you said, in today's competitive environment, what is being promoted, what is the ask from leaders is, how quickly you can turn around things, how quickly can you quote unquote win, how much of result orientation can you demonstrate, and how independent can you be, and how competitive are you. And these are all traits and these are all inclinations of people who are highly competitive. And of course, competitiveness is definitely something that is required. However, as you also pointed out, the issue really here is that simultaneously we also need the exact opposite paradigm, which is that of collaboration. And that's not really an easy task. So if you look at Chaitanya's reactions, they were based on his orientation of being competitive. And the good thing is that at least he was aware about it. But in today's situation, when we are looking at leadership situations, we expect leaders to compete, yes, but we equally expect them to collaborate, because without collaboration, you don't come up with new thinking. You need diversity, you need collaboration, you need long-term. And for that long-term perspective, you need alignment of different people with different perspectives. Now, the issue for people really here is that if I have an inclination to be one way, most of us have these inclinations, these personalities, then how can I also be a Jekyll and Dr. Hyde, right? So these are exact opposite dimensions, and I'm expected really to be both. And that's a tall ask from leaders today. But the fact is that the ask is not that you become a Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Hyde. The ask is, can you flexibly move between the two paradigms as is required in the situation? Because otherwise it becomes very detrimental to the organization. And to be able to be adaptable and to be able to be flexible in moving between and solving dichotomy situations, what is really required is a lot of emotional maturity. One of the things that now has come up from research is that as adults and as leaders, develop, as long as they are in leadership roles and even beyond, the more they develop, the more agile they are, the more flexible they are. So I think that what we are really talking about here is that, of course, it was important for Chaitanya to manage his bias. He was an independent person. He was a person who had started the company. He wanted to see quick wins and all of that. And that bias was really about, I need to win, rather than seeing a win-win perspective. Of course, he needed to manage his emotions, especially anxiety in this situation, where he quickly saw an error and saw an opportunity. He needed to hold back that anxiety and manage his stress. The more important thing is for leaders to begin to start looking at valuing differences, and that is really at a value level. It is really at a deeper level, which then helps to transcend differences and be able to build win-win. Pretty much like what we saw Dr. Mandela be able to do in the situation that we talked about earlier. And I think that's really the ask, that can we be more empathic? Can we look at more cues? So let's take another example of this. Leaders may not be in a situation of, let's say, Chaitanya or Nelson Mandela, but all of us here are leaders in our own right, where we hold, for example, team meetings. Now, in team meetings, you want different views to come up, you want that diversity. But what you also want a leader to be able to do is to notice how people are reacting with respect to the decisions that are being taken. So, is there, for example, someone who has zoomed out? Is there someone who's a strong supporter? But sometimes even people who are overt supporters can be actually resistors. So leaders need to watch out for these cues through using empathy so that they're able to then conclude the meeting in a way where everybody is aligned. And when people are really aligned, that's an emotional process. When that emotional process happens, of course, victory follows in terms of whatever they're trying to lead.
Sure, Anita, thank you for sharing that. And now let's look at leading change situation through our third guest, Nikhil. Nikhil, over to you.
Hi everybody, this is Nikhil here. I am the CEO at an IT firm that has had amazing success in the financial year 2015-16. Our shareholders and directors want to capitalize on this success and aim higher, much higher, like almost 50% as compared to our last year. So most of the HODs have been finding these targets to be especially challenging. There was definite resistance to the new target, and I knew something had to be done. I myself found this target to be challenging, but I felt a sense of excitement for it. I wanted to transfer that excitement to the rest of the people at my firm. I proposed to take everyone for a day-long retreat to congratulate them for last year's performance and set targets for the upcoming year. It only took a while before the hostility towards the target became clear. Although I was prepared for this, I did underestimate the level of resistance I faced. I understood that there was a need for me to understand everyone's perspective. I allowed and made sure that everyone had the chance to raise their doubts and apprehensions, all the while looking for an opportunity to change gears. I have noticed that people tend to be more open to listen when they feel understood. So I started to summarize the concerns they raised. The HOD seemed relieved to see that I realized how tough the ask was. That's when I changed gears. I spoke with conviction about the goal, building in excitement. I stressed on their abilities and the advantages a company had as a first mover. Post this, we spent an hour planning to achieve the goals and to overcome any and all challenges. Although we did not reach our target of 50% growth, we were not far from the goal either. I think two things helped us reach this target: my genuine concern for the inhibitions raised and the strong belief and excitement I had about attaining the impossible.
So, Nikhil, thank you very much. And I think this is an example of something that has worked very well. And just to summarize what Nikhil has already said, I think 2-3 things really work very well. Firstly, the understanding that leadership situations are mostly social. And the good news is that our brains are also very socially wired. So what that means is there is an opportunity for leaders to connect very strongly at an emotional level in a very natural way if they learn this trick. Now, what Nikhil did very well in this situation was, first of all, he used empathy because he allowed people to really talk through their objections. And what he said was, it was not just that he listened, and I want to stress for a moment on this word listening, because again, research shows that most of us think we are very good listeners, but actually it is a skill which is fairly evolved and learns and needs a lot of learning and training to be able to develop. So here Nikhil was able to really listen well and demonstrate to his team that he really cared about their concerns. Not that he agreed with their concerns, but he was with them. And then he was able to change gears and demonstrate very positive emotions, which he himself genuinely and authentically also felt. So it wasn't as though he was demonstrating an emotion which was not something that he was feeling or believing in, but he used these positive emotions to generate positive emotions in others, something that is called mirror neurons. And this is again what research is showing, that it is because our brains are so socially wired, it is very possible for us to use emotions to create the same emotions in somebody else. So if you see the image in front of you and you're seeing two leaders over here, they are mirroring each other's emotions. Whatever is the emotion one person is feeling is also the emotion that the other person is feeling. And this is a great tool in the hands of leaders, that if they want to get their teams to feel excited, if they can genuinely be excited themselves and learn how to demonstrate that excitement, that's the emotion that will get transferred in the team itself. So mirror neurons is really helping leaders now to look at how can they use emotions to create the right emotions in others, as can be seen in this image. And the good thing is, one of the points that is mentioned on the slide, that our emotions can be carried or impacted by up to 3 people or 3 degrees away. That's the power of emotion, and that is the power of social brain. So this is an example very well brought out by Nikhil. And just to summarize these 3 examples, what we've looked at is 3 situations that leaders face. How are these difficult situations linked to emotional intelligence? How are these also linked to the leadership situations that leaders go through? And what are some of the ways in which this can be built? So we'll go into the last objective which we want to cover, because we want to leave time for some question and answers. This is about understanding how emotional intelligence gets developed. And we'll just share some thoughts that we have from our experience of working in this field since 2000. But I'm sure this is a field which is constantly evolving and is also giving us an opportunity to constantly evolve. Now, you will agree with me that emotional intelligence cannot be taught, in the sense that it cannot be taught cognitively. And hence, one of the tools that we use, one of the tools that we had used in all these situations, whether there was the situations that you've just listened to, was using what we call the personal EQ meter. And what this helps us to do is to have authentic conversations which are based on the way people feel and on the way they process information, as opposed to what is visible in terms of behavior. So of course this tool helps us to have more meaningful, coaching-oriented conversations which help a person to understand their own profiles better. But in terms of what are some of the practices that are being used, and what we also recommend is focusing on, for example, practices like mindfulness and mind sight. And these are, of course, now being really researched to cause changes in the brain which are more long lasting and extremely helpful for leaders to manage the VUCA environment. So we definitely recommend these practices for leaders, and of course this is catching up in a very big way in organizations as well. We talk about the need to understand and manage biases, and this is a difficult one because, like I mentioned earlier, biases operate at an unconscious level. So what that means is that leaders are encouraged to look at situations which cause them emotional turmoil, and then see in that situation, can they look at what bias comes up, which is obviously looking at it from a perspective of what has happened in the past, and what is a new way that they would like to look at the situation. And also what we encourage leaders to do through the ways of development is that in areas where they feel a surge of emotions, it is a good idea to also get different perspectives of others, because then it helps you to view at several perspectives before you can take a decision. The third thing is resilience, and resilience is of course coming up in a very, very big way. There are multiple tools for this, but one of the tools is cognitive reappraisal. We use this a lot in our work in coaching and in development of emotional intelligence, because we do know that in today's chaotic world we will sort of flip over, but the important thing is how quickly do we come back, and what can we teach people so that it helps them to quickly get centered again. The need for listening and empathy is only growing, and we talk about things like generative conversations, which means building on differences and allowing conversations to move to higher levels of consciousness so that we can solve problems which in a more holistic way, in a more long-lasting way. And for this, what is really important is listening. And I think we really promote this, and we also help people develop this through the process of development. And finally, we're talking about being able to learn how to use our brains more effectively. And one application of that is mirror neurons. So leaders have done this all the while. So sometimes it's not just about positive emotions. You want a team to feel anxious, so how do you transmit that anxiety? But it is really learning to use the brain in a more effective way, which is something that can really help us in our emotional intelligence journey. Sorry, I missed this one. So self-development, we've covered this. Clearly, this is a lifelong objective and must be practiced by leaders who wish to really lead more effectively. With that, I would just like to close this section by talking through a quote by the CEO of Kevin Roberts. Now, he was the CEO of Saatchi & Saatchi from 1997 to 2016. And what he says is the following: in my 35 years in business, I have always trusted my emotions. I have always believed that by touching emotion, you get the best people to work for you, the best clients to inspire you, and the best partners and most devoted customers. So we welcome you to welcome emotions in your life and not to push them away, but also learn how to handle and deal with them so that you're more effective in not only your work life, but also your personal life. So, Pooja, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Neeta, for sharing such a wonderful insight on emotionally intelligent leadership. We can now see a few questions have started coming in, and Neeta will now take these questions. Please feel free to use the chat box feature in case you have still not sent in your questions, or if you have any more questions to ask. We will now try answering as many as we can. And Neeta, there's the first question is actually regarding, and I'll just read it out to you. It says, are senior leaders open to developing emotional intelligence, as most leaders believe it is not required for them?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, Pooja, because truly people who require it the most are most resistant to really develop it. And I can talk about senior leadership, at least in this forum, absolutely openly, that they require it because they are actually in a situation where they're facing maximum amount of complexity. So they require that. They require it because in senior positions, you're pretty much alone. You don't have that much of a peer group to learn from, and you're pretty much left on your own to manage yourself. So they really require it for support as well. But like you said, the belief, and that's because I guess there are egos, there are insecurities and so on. The belief really is that I have reached this level because I'm emotionally intelligent. What is it that you're going to try and tell me which is different? So one of the ways in which we've countered this in the past, and we really use emotional intelligence a lot when we talk about, for example, senior team development, is by using questionnaires, is by using psychometrics, because then it's about focusing on the situation, but then using the tool to focus on what is happening within. And usually leaders then are quite open to it after they cross over the first barrier. And I'll just take an example. Just very recently, we were looking at coaching a senior leader. And in his profile, one of the things that came up, which is to do with more his internal way of processing, is that he was very detail averse. And this detail averse tendency, or should I say orientation, was causing a lot of the competencies that he was good in, was not, so the best in that competency was not really being demonstrated. Now, when we went into looking at this aspect of detail aversion, he was not detail conscious at all. What really came up with was the way he was processing information. And we talked about system 1 and system 2. Now the fact is that he was very equipped to use system 2. He's a very intuitive person, a person who's highly intelligent, looks into the future, long-term focused, and so on and so forth. Also very emotionally mature. But just his orientation of looking at things from a high level was not allowing him to use the aspect of intuition along with looking at some details and then being able to use system 2 very effectively. And one of the reasons for this was he had never looked at this internally himself. And when we use the emotional intelligence questionnaire to look at how this is impacting himself, how it's impacting especially his relationships around, that's when he realized that how a very simple thing in certain situations could help him change his perspective and therefore look at using the competencies that he was very strong in also more powerfully. And I think we broke this ice simply because we said, it's not about you, let's look at how you do it. And it's not good or bad, but the questionnaire and the personal EQ meter really helped us to really nail the real issue and helped him see how this issue was impacting situations.
Okay.
So that's how we really look at managing senior audiences or senior people, senior stakeholders. But to your question, actually, they need it a lot more, I would say.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Neeta. Now we'll take a question from Preeti Yadav. And the question is, till how long one need to be supported? After all, you want your managers to be independent and own for their risks and rewards both.
Right. I was thinking about this some time back. It's like in the days when things were simple, all of us had gurus, all of us had sages, all of us had leaders. We listened to them, and because we listened to them, our lives were okay. But in today's context, there is no one person who can tell you everything. We don't have those sages and those leaders anymore. In fact, we don't encourage heroic leaders anymore. We want everybody to develop leadership, right? So in that situation where that structure has gone away, and in place of that structure there is even more chaos, there is definitely a need for some coaching, some mentoring for almost all leaders at some point in their life. I think the trick over here is it's not as if you have to provide it to them for their entire life, but I think you have to provide it to them in important transitions. That's one. You have to provide it to them when things are, let's say for an organization, extremely chaotic. So there is a situation externally that has created greater chaos, or there is an emergency, or there is a crisis. But I think what leaders in my experience have done, is when they get this little bit of support, they learn to support themselves as well, because a good coach helps that process. So it's not about creating dependency on the coach or on the mentor, but it is how do you make that person independent to think of those situations themselves, which is really what is the idea and what is what the process should achieve.
Okay. Thank you, Neeta. And the next question is, when hiring in most of the progressive organization, it is based upon IQ and knowledge of subject, but how do you link it back to emotional quotient, basically? That's the question.
Yeah, and that is the traditional way. Even now, if we look at a lot of our psychometric tests, they talk about reason, logic, they talk about comprehension. So these are IQ kind of tools and IQ kind of tests. However, I think that in the market today, there are more and more of EQ tests also available. Sometimes organizations use it because they do realize that in leadership role, it's not just IQ. In fact, in senior leadership role, we all know that EQ plays a more important, is a better predictor of success. So of course, these tools are available. I think that, however, what I would say, it's not just using a tool. It is also learning how to ask the right type of questions in the entire process of talent acquisition, which means making the interviewing process a lot more robust, not just looking at information and data, which is IQ-led. It's very easy to get that. But how do we train our leaders to even ask questions which helps to get more data around the way a person processes information, what are their mental models, what is the way they look at, or what emotions sort of get in their way, what is the emotional profile, the maturity, and these are things that also in a qualitative way one can gather through the processes of interviewing and the other processes that exist. So I would say that yes, if an organization really understands and believes that, one is of course what tools do they use, and can they also look at an EQ tool, and can they look at what is the information that they're getting from the tool. They have to be trained to be able to read that tool, but also can they in their processes of interviewing or talent acquisition also ensure that there are that the leaders or the interviewers have an ability to ask the right kind of questions, to really be able to listen to the data and to be able to interpret it in a more emotional, intelligent way. I think that would help in being able to get the right kind of answers to this.
So the next question is, can you please explain the concept of cognitive reprisal a little more and how it leads to developing EI?
Right. So cognitive reappraisal really comes from a lot of cognitive therapy work that psychologists have done. I guess I'll explain it in a very simple way. I think what it means is that whenever there is an emotional situation, the way we react and the way we respond is that our brain very quickly brings up these biases, brings up these paradigms, brings up past beliefs. And what we do then is we view that situation from that lens, not from the way the situation exists, but from the frame of that lens. So for example, let's go back to the example that we looked at earlier, Sahil's example. What did he do? He looked at the situation from a frame of, this guy is never going to trust me anymore. That may not be reality, but that became his reality for that moment. And it is through that reality that he took a decision. Cognitive reappraisal simply means, can we look at our thoughts, cognitive part of our brain, can there be another way to look at it, right? So we encourage people to say, this is the way you thought. Could there be another thought to it? Can you reappraise your thought? Can you reappraise your cognitive response? And look at another way of looking at the same situation. And when you help people do that, people say, yeah, it's not as if he will think the worst of me. He would be possibly disappointed, yeah. And now that's another thought. And that will lead to another feeling, and that will lead to another behavior or an action. So cognitive reappraisal really means giving people or helping people firstly understand that in emotional situations, the way they look at situations itself could be slightly faulty. So can we give them tools in which they can re-look at that situation and therefore take better decisions, and also have different, more, I would say, emotions that can be managed more effectively. We really teach this through many tools and exercises. One of the tools that we teach people is the ABCD tool. It's a simple tool. I don't know if it's available on the net. But in our workshops, for example, we do use this, and it's one of the biggest takeaways. So thank you for the question. It's an important question, I believe.
Okay, so this is the last question in interest of time that we are taking, and rest of them we'll be taking offline later on. However, this would be the last question. Allow me just a minute to a fundamental question are the so data analytics is about using more of facts and rely less on guts. Is EI opposite of that, especially in context to the quote on the last slide?
Yeah. So no, EI is not saying don't look at data, don't look at data analytics. But EI is also teaching people how to look at data which is not stated. So for example, the earlier point that we took, unstated needs of customers is never going to come through logical data. It comes through observation, if you like, and observation is also a way of collecting data of the way people are acting or interacting or possibly showing in their non-verbal language, body language. And you will agree with me that when we're talking about design thinking today, design thinking has really become the buzzword. But the center of design thinking is looking at information which is emotional in nature, right? Of course, in advertising, people have always looked at it because the emotional brain looks at information from a longer term. So you appeal to the emotions of your audiences in advertising. In design thinking today, when we are looking at customer data, we're not saying that the past trends, we're not saying that information which is logic based is not important. It is very important. But we need to also look at information around how people behave, what do they actually do, what is the non-verbal kind of information we are gathering, because this is helping us to predict not just data coming to us from the past, but also looking at what are the predictive models we can then create when we have this holistic understanding of, let's say, customers, or let's say a situation, or let's say, themselves as well, people themselves as well. So yes, IQ is very important, data analytics is very important, but that is not the only thing. I think what is equally important is people-related information, which you really gather through processes of empathy, and that forms the central theme today of design thinking.
Thank you, Neeta, and all the guests, Sahil, Chaitanya, and Nikhil, for a very insightful and engaging session on emotionally intelligent leadership. I would also especially like to thank all our participants for today. Please feel free to connect with Neeta offline for any further query on her coordinates and how we can collaborate in future to impact your business results. You can see Neeta's coordinates right now flashing on your screens. You can write to her. And for those questions which we could not answer at this moment, we would be happy to take it offline, and you are also most welcome to connect offline with Neeta. Thank you so much. Have a great day ahead.